Hi, so I thought I'd do a video today about relationship problems, and I'm going to be looking at them through the lens of spirituality. And I'm only going to touch on one or two issues, potentially, and going to take a little look about potential ways in which you can get yourself stronger, because you can't fix another person, but you can get yourself stronger and get yourself into a place of perhaps better receptivity to be in a relationship and so on and so forth. So it's ultimately going to be looking at yourself through the lens of compassion and love and a good deal of spiritual stuff as well. So if any of that is useful or might be useful, pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and we'll see how this goes. And I wanted to make a video because there's so very many relationship issues going on this planet. Always have been, right? Always have been. It's really hard to navigate. And our closest relationships can be the most difficult thing in the world. But if you switch to a spiritual perspective, then they're a place of learning and growth potential, right? And it isn't just about you being a bit worn down by a relationship, but it offers great potential for growing and learning in yourself if you let it. So it's about flipping your perception straight off the bat. Instead of putting yourself into victim mentality, because you're never a victim, unless you're actually enslaved in some way, or you're in a relationship with a dark personality type, in which case you could be a victim and you'd need professional help. But for most of us in Western society, you're not a victim. So you need to get yourself out of victim mentality, and you need to get your agency back, your sovereignty back. If you're in a place where you're consistently complaining about a partner, the more you complain about your partner, the more you give away your personal agency. It's a very disempowering thing to do. And it can be a bit of a negative spiral. It can become habitual. It's a way of dodging blame for yourself and how you're showing up. Very often in relationships, the person we're with can act in a compensatory way to ourselves. So sometimes if your partner is showing up with very challenging behaviour, it could be because they're responding to a perceived lack in you. So whereas you're blaming them and you're just going, oh my God, they're showing up like this, they're showing up in this terrible way, they're not helping me, they are hindering me, they are not pulling their weight in this relationship. It might be that they are perceiving that maybe you have stretched yourself too thin, that maybe this could be detrimental to your health, that maybe there are issues there that you have not seen or addressed fully, and therefore you have triggered fears within them and they are acting out on these fears. That's just one example of many. Ultimately, you're going to need to have a talk to your partner, right from the word go. And you're going to need to open up in order to do that and to be vulnerable. And especially if you're in a loop of behaviour, so say you've been in a loop of the same behaviour for maybe some time, and maybe you're very tired of it, and maybe you feel like you just haven't done enough. You just need to work harder. You just need to push more. You just need to bend it to the sheer force of your will. And yet it hasn't worked. And I would say there's a reason it hasn't worked, and maybe you're not fully cognizant of the reason yet. Chances are, if you're trying to bend it to your will, then you're not paying attention to what's actually occurring, because there are many forces at play in a relationship, and we're always co-creating with the divine. And there could be a bigger pattern going on than you're aware of. Trying to bend something by the sheer force of your will, it's not going to work. It seems like quite prideful behaviour for a start. It's quite egotistical. Perhaps it's fear of being able to admit where you need help and things as well. And especially if things like, if say you're in very negative feelings, so say if you're feeling bitter or resentful, I'd say these are red flags. These are red flags. These are not emotions you want to spend any time in. So if you're there, you can't bypass them, but you need to process them and work with them and understand the reasons why. Resentfulness can come, again, from a place of lack. You perceive something missing from your partner, and you're projecting that onto them. You're saying they need to show up with this and they are not. Bitterness, too, can come from this place of this sort of wounded inner child, maybe, or this wound within that hasn't been addressed. And so you need to take care of that as much as you can. You need to identify these wounds. And you need to be able to be a bit open and a bit vulnerable with your partner. And chances are, if you're in this place of trying to force it to work, you're not doing the very thing that you need to do, which is drop into your heart, get out of your head and drop into your heart. Because one of you is going to need to soften and look at this from a bit more of a raw, vulnerable perspective. And there is a risk. When we open up to another, there's always a risk, of being hurt, etc. But our closest relationships, we should be able to be a bit open and a bit vulnerable with our partners. We should be able to do that. And nothing really changes until we are. You can't do the work of another. You can't do the work of another. But you can go within and identify feelings within you and then work out ways to communicate them openly and honestly. And that's the first step. And that can be sometimes the step people forget to do. People can get into a place of moaning or complaining about a partner. Sometimes what they're seeing may be correct, but sometimes it may not. As I say, it could be that their partner is acting in a particular way out of some perceived lack. And it could be that you have projected something onto them, or they've projected something onto you. Or it could be something that you've just completely missed. So say, for example, your partner is, maybe they overstep the mark, and maybe you find them just being quite horrible to maybe your friends or other people, and just overcompensating for you. So maybe you could be trying to help a lot of people, and then they might step in and get really angry. You might think, well, why are they getting so angry? Well, it could be that their anger is because maybe they see that you're trying to help so many people, but you're spreading yourself too thin. And maybe out of pride, or maybe out of just an inability to be vulnerable, you're not able to say where you need help, and you're not able to do the things that you need to do. Now, it isn't a cool thing to step into a boundary of somebody else, right? So you'd need to have a conversation with them. They'd need to have a conversation with you. You'd need to be able to open up, and they'd need to be able to say to you, look, when you say you can do this, and this to your next door neighbour, it worries me, because then you stretch yourself too thin. You give too much of yourself. You get really tired afterwards. You find it really hard to cope. And so I feel the need to step in on your behalf, right? And then you could work on your own boundaries. They could learn to back off, because it isn't appropriate to step into somebody else's space in that way. And they could learn to trust you to actually say no to people when you needed to say no, and say yes to people when you are able to say yes. In other words, in that scenario, you'd be the one who needs to actually be able to see your own shortcomings, to be able to realistically say what you can do, show up to that, and then say what you can't do and release that, and so on and so forth. So that's just one example of where people feel the need to overcompensate for others. And there are many examples like that. So when you start complaining about a partner and their behaviour, the best thing that you can do is to get out of that place of resentment or bitterness. Get into a place of compassion have a chat with them and be honest and say, when you do this, it's disempowering, or when you do this, it makes me feel not seen, or it makes me feel unhappy, and so on and so forth. And then they themselves could say, oh, well, I act like this because you don't do that. And when you don't do that, I feel like you're missing it and it makes me panic, and so on and so forth. And so I'm coming from a place of panic and pure knee-jerk reaction. In other words, you have to have a really open conversation with your partner to start with and to see what's what. And you have to be able to see their view with compassion. Are they acting out of fear, or are they acting out of love? And if there's a distortive behaviour, they're acting out of fear, out of lack, something missing, they're triggered. So why are they triggered? It might be that it has nothing to do with you. It could be something else entirely. But the first best place to start is with yourself and being open and vulnerable with your partner. Because as I say, very often people can get into the pattern of behaviour that's most comfortable for them. Maybe the pattern is to be in their heads, but not in their hearts. So you have to do the uncomfortable thing, and you have to go into your heart, and you have to be a bit raw and a bit honest and say what's going on to start it off, and not in a resentful way, not in a way that's going to trigger equal resentment or equal knee-jerk reactionary responses, but just in an open and honest way. And it's okay, so when you do this, it makes me feel, it makes me feel not seen, or it makes me feel vulnerable, or it makes me feel sad, or it makes me feel on my own here, and so on and so forth, and start the conversation. And see how they respond, Are they responding in kind? Are they responding equally openly? Or are they being a bit guarded? You can't change another. And if you're trying to do all the work, say, for a relationship, it cannot work. The centre cannot hold. Collapse is imminent. It's just a question of when. And it might be that it can be avoided, but it takes two to want it to work. And it's going to take both parties to get into a bit of a place of vulnerability, to admit where they feel wounded, where they feel they are hurting, where they feel unsupported, where they feel the concerns are, and to have this authentic conversation. And that's where couples counselling could come in, right? Because you might not be able to have these conversations too easily, or to even be able to steer them yourselves, because it might be that it goes into a battle of wits, or a battle of intellect, or, being guarded. And then maybe it becomes a fight. So maybe you need a counsellor, because a counsellor could help mediate and steer things perhaps back to a bit more of a heart-centred perspective. So I would suggest counselling if you haven't had counselling. And if you take your partner to a counsellor, if they are willing to go, then that's a start, right? Because they're equally willing to work on it with you. If they're going to take the time to go and see a counsellor with you, that indicates strongly that they are equally committed to wanting this relationship to work as well. So if things have got into a bit of a bad state, I would suggest counselling together. And I would also suggest meditation, because that can help bring things to the light of awareness. And I would also just suggest that you pay very careful attention to how you are showing up. If you want to complain about them, look at yourself, look at yourself, because the more we complain about another, the less we are looking at our own behaviour and how we're showing up. And maybe we're behaving quite selfishly without even realising, So it's really important to look at your own behaviour. Have compassion for yourself and hold yourself with a bit of love and a bit of care while you're doing that. Because it's hard. It's hard to go within. It requires a bit of courage. All of us have flaws. There are no flawless humans, not even a guru, And so often you hear about some scandals involving gurus, or, even, obviously religious centres, but other spiritual centres or groups or God knows what, because there are no flawless humans. We've all got work to do. And that's why it's really important as well to come back to yourself and through meditation, empower yourself. Empower yourself. You're still going to need help from other people, of course you will, but you can empower yourself in getting yourself out of victim mentality, because you're not a victim. You're not a victim. We've all got the divine within us. We are all of us eternal beings. We can never die. The soul never dies. We just get recycled. We're recycled souls, you know, and stardust. And we are all of us loved by the divine. You are loved beyond measure by the divine. You hold great love within you. We've been given the idea by our present society that we must place great primacy on the intellect over the heart, that this is more important than this. That isn't true. You know, it's great if you've got a rational, logical mind and you can reason your way out of various things. That's fantastic. But if you do that at the expense of this, then you're lopsided. There's an imbalance. And this carries great wisdom. You have great wisdom within the heart. And ideally, you need the marriage of the intellect and the heart. You need both, you know? And you need to be able to drop into the heart with authenticity. And it requires courage. It requires courage to meet yourself and to find yourself lacking. And then to be able to emotionally talk about this with another human, about the areas that you're lacking, with great courage, with great honesty, with great self-respect, with great self-love. Don't let anyone else denigrate you, put you down in any way, shape or form. You're still a fantastic human. You've just got flaws. Congratulations. Welcome to the human race, you know. But it takes great courage to admit them sometimes, because some people perceive that as weakness, and it is not. It's a weakness to not admit to them, because then you're more likely to collapse, because you're trying to shoulder the weight of the world on your own. No one can do that. It takes great courage to be honest with another, to say, hey, I'm not doing so well today. I need a little help. Maybe people can feel like a failure sometimes when they say those words, but that's the most courageous step. There's no failure there. There's no failure there. And anyway, failing is a part of life, right? We fail and we learn. It's only through many failures in my life that I've learned an awful lot about who I am now. It's only through an awful lot of dark nights of the soul that I've learned an awful lot about who I am now. And it can take sometimes a real tower moment, a real destabilization of self to understand more about ourselves. And the greatest lessons we ever learn are often through the darkest of nights. But there can be the greatest gifts and the most deepest beauty on the other side when we discover that we were stronger than we ever dared imagine, and that we hold so much wisdom within, hold so much power within. That's a very beautiful moment, you know, and we all do this, we all hold this. It's just sometimes life doesn't push us to discover it. So allow yourself to be vulnerable, allow yourself to share your feelings with your partner, especially if you're on a merry-go-round, if you're on this loop of behaviour where they're acting a certain way, you react a certain way. Neither is healthy. You know, when was the last time you just sat down and said, hey, can we have a chat? When you do this, I feel like that. And if they start to get defensive, just try and find a way to counter that defensiveness with a bit of love and a bit of compassion, so that you don't end up in some sort of battle of the ego, but drop into your heart and admit your own flaws and weaknesses, which will help them break down their own barriers over theirs as well. There's a book I would recommend to anybody struggling with relationship problems, and it's a book called Love An Inner Connection by a lady called Carol K. Anthony. And she looks at relationships through the lens of the I Ching, so Eastern philosophy. The idea is that when you meet somebody, you know them on a soul level. When you meet someone who you instantly feel something for, or, you develop a connection with them. Sometimes you develop this connection before the rational mind can even really appreciate what's going on. So chances are you know this person on a soul level, and it's a soul connection. And the soul connection itself is very pure and very beautiful. But what happens is the ego mind leaps in and monkeys around with everything and messes everything up, right? It's just what the ego does, depending on how aware or unaware you are in terms of spiritual development and so on and so forth, how prideful you are and things like this. Your ego can really do a number, right? So this book looks at it from that lens and looks at ways in which our egos can jump in and make a bit of a mess of relationships, from trying to quantify the whole thing, from trying to put a relationship into a category that maybe it was never meant to be in, and so on and so forth, from not respecting another's boundaries to trying to fix problems for them, and so on and so forth. Codependency, you name it. This book looks at pretty much, some pretty main problems and fear-based problems, because most of these problems are born out of fear, out of a necessity perhaps to feel in control, out of a necessity perhaps to feel superior to others, or God knows what it is, all ego, all the problems born from the ego, not from the soul, So I just find it an immensely helpful book, and I'd recommend that book to anyone, anyone ever on the planet. The minute you're old enough to have a relationship, I would say give somebody this book, because it's tremendously helpful as a way of looking at your own behaviour and how you can show up better. Because it's all a challenge, all of it, and an invitation to how we can show up better. And I don't mean better as in materialistic gain in any way, shape or form. I mean better as in how more authentic can we be? How more vulnerable dare we be with ourselves, let alone another? How more honest, how greater levels of integrity can we show up with, and so on and so forth. There are always depths to mine. There are always levels to go to. And if you start blaming relationship problems on superficial things, you're going to run into problems if you don't just deep dive on occasion and just examine those things and think, okay, so I show up with this behaviour, but this isn't necessarily the cause. So what could be the cause of this behaviour? What's my associated feelings with that? Start there. Start with your very self, And I'm not in any way condoning bad behaviour, right? So if, say, you have a partner who shows up with terrible behaviour, I'm not saying you have to put up with that or deal with that. Of course you do not. But assuming it's not so bad that you need to immediately quit, put a ring of salt around yourself and grab a crucifix and start praying, assuming it's not on that level, then it's something potentially that you can work with. And if you can really work with it and through it, chances are you and your partner are going to build even more solid foundations, right? Because you're being that open and that vulnerable with another. And you're coming out of this resentment, because resentment is a wall. Every time you feel resentment or bitter, you might as well just build a bloody fortress around yourself. And then you expect them to break through that fortress. It's not happening. You're the one that's got to knock the sodding fortress walls down. You're the one that has to approach them. You have to do it, because you're the one noticing these problems at the moment. They're not, or they might have different problems that they're not communicating to you. You can't do anything about that, but you can do something about yourself with great love, holding yourself in great compassion, because you're worth it. You're always worth that compassion and that love, Just don't allow yourself to stay in this fortress of bitterness and despair and unhappiness and resentment, because that is not a place. That is not a place to build a relationship from or to fortify your relationship together. You both want to be in the fortress together, right? And then you've got each other's backs and you're looking out on the world, you know. There was a book I read once, or started to read. I've got it upstairs. It looked like a really cool book. And it's called A Piece of Mirror. And I don't remember who it's by. I think it's called A Piece of Mirror. And it was just really cool. It was just reflections on life, you know, philosophical musings and such. And this guy just said one cool thing about when you're in partnership with another, how some people make the mistake of they come together in partnership and they're sort of facing each other against the world. So it's just them. That is to say, the world shrinks. They focus entirely on each other and let the world go, you know. And he said a far healthier way is to come together with another, like back to back. So you've got each other's backs. You are together. You are a strong unit, but you're facing out in the world. So you've got each other, so you can fortify each other. You are stronger through your connection, but then you can still be in the world, still be dealing with whatever you need to deal with in the world. You know, it's far healthier connection. Don't shut the world out, you know, when you come together with another. And it can be a terrific learning and growing experience. And this is your person, and you clearly want to be with them and you clearly love them. Your feelings of bitterness or resentment, etc., are your signals as to how great your love is and how deep your hurt goes. So instead of allowing those feelings to flourish, you need to dive deep into them. Admit to yourself where you're feeling wounded. Admit to yourself the hurt, the pain, and all of the shit, all of the difficult stuff. Do that and then show up with a little bit of courage and a whole lot of love to your partner and say, hey, when you've been acting like this and I've been reacting like that, I'm feeling like this is a pattern of behaviour that isn't working. Can we talk about it? And maybe tell them how much you love them as well and how much you want it to work and how much you need their help in order to do that. And open it up like that, right from the bloody heart. Shoot from the hip. Tell them what they mean to you, you know? But ultimately, only you can do that work on yourself. They can't do it for you. You can't do theirs for them. So the first thing is the conversation. The next thing is counselling, etc. together. The next thing is meditation, doing work on yourself to love yourself, nourish yourself and cherish yourself. And if you think, oh, I can't do any of that, then you've got a bit of work to do, you know. You've got to have a place of self-love, and not in a narcissistic, grandiose way, anything like that, just compassion. I'm talking about compassionate care and appreciation for who you are. You've got this far in life. You're awesome, right? Have some appreciation for who you are and all the good bits, and have a bit of compassion for the bad bits too, and the not so beautiful parts. And understand that there are reasons for those as well, and have compassion for those. Work on them where you can and go within and do the work on yourself rather than projecting all of your blame and anger and annoyance at this other person. And as I say, it doesn't condone really bad behaviour. So if you really get to a point, maybe after months of working in an open way, in an open and flexible way with your partner, and it isn't working, then maybe you need to have another conversation with them then. But see how it goes. You know? Someone said the definition of madness is repeating the same behaviour and expecting different results. And that's true, isn't it? If you're showing up to this person with the same behaviour and they're showing up with the same behaviour and nothing is changing, it's not going to. One of you has to soften first. And sometimes it can be a prideful thing, can't it? You might think, well, they act like this. I'm not going to be the first one to show up unzipped, naked, vulnerable in front of my partner. It's not going to happen. It's exactly what needs to happen. And then you'll know you've done everything you can do. If you're in that mindset of going, I have to know that I've done everything I can do, but you're pushing, striving, trying to force, then you're not doing it. You're not. You're just repeating a pattern of behaviour. You have to take a step back and do something different. And that's going to maybe spark fears within you, maybe quite deep-seated. Sometimes we think we want change without actually being prepared for what that really means, because it can mean we have to change too, right? It isn't just this other person that has to change. It isn't just them ever that has to change. It's both of you. And it might mean both of you showing up with a bit of courage. And again, there is no blame here in this video. It could be that out in the real world, you're both amazing, courageous people. But as I say, there are areas of weakness within all of us. There are areas we dare not go sometimes for fear of the pain or for fear of the difficulty. And that can be in so many different ways. We end up in little habitual patterns in all sorts of ways, from comfort eating to repeating the same routine, etc. And ultimately, a spiritual path is one that will chuck you out of your comfort zones in some ways, depending on how deep down the path you're prepared to go. You know, for some people, they have to go all of the way out of their comfort zones. And that can be the most horrendously difficult thing. And I'm not saying you have to do any of that necessarily, but you're going to have to try to challenge yourself a little bit in those areas that you'd rather not. You know, maybe get a bit vulnerable with your partner and open up and talk, and especially look at ways in which you've become habituated to. So, for example, I talk a bit about avoidance, if that's a theme, because that isn't helpful either. And yeah, and just so on and so forth, you know. But going within and doing that work within and having some self-love and self-care is really important. As within, so without. I tend to look at relationships in a spiritual way, that they are all mirrors of ourselves in one way or the other, right? What we have inside us is what we tend to attract into our lives in one way or another. So they serve as a mirror, really powerful mirror. It's law of attraction stuff at its most basic. Some people try and game the law of attraction by saying if you really think about what you want and try and embody it, sort of like Stanislavski in terms of acting, you know, if you really embody it and feel all the concomitant feelings of this thing, that maybe you can materialize it in your life. And I haven't tried this. I have no idea if that's true. It sounds kind of exhausting to me. I tend to think of it in more simple terms, in more basic terms, at its very core, in that who we are is what we will attract into our lives, and what we are showing up with inside, in what we are looking at, what we are prepared to look at within, and how deep we're willing to go is going to be reflected in our outer world, which is why if you can do an awful lot of work spiritually, and sometimes it might not even be that much work required, but if you do a bit of shadow work, a little bit of work on a little bit of honesty in the areas you'd rather not look at within, you're going to notice you level up on the outside in all areas of your life. Showing up with that bit of courage in one area of your life has a ripple effect in every other area of your life and will make everything better. You know, it really will. For example, if you yourself are lacking in confidence very much and lacking in self-respect, it could be that you find you attracting, unfortunately, a partner who is not very respectful of you. And you go, oh God, they don't treat me with respect, yada, yada, yada. And I would always say, how are you showing up? Do you treat yourself with respect? Because when you start with that, you're strengthening your core, you're strengthening your spiritual core, you know, your emotional core. If you start by treating yourself with that care and that respect, then you just won't stand for it if somebody else does not, you know. You could try working on it with them, but if they show no interest of change or they cannot, then you can let them go with love and you can say, okay, well, that person is not for me. Even if you love the heck out of them, you will have too much damn self-respect to let yourself get treated badly, and then you're going to level up. Again, then you will level up, because then you will not take any nonsense from anyone. You won't take any bad behaviour from a boss, from a co-worker, from your partners, etc. So again, it will have this ripple effect in all areas of your life. So the only person you can work on is yourself. And that's the most important thing. It's the most important thing. You know, if you can show up with a bit of courage, honesty and integrity, you're going to find that it is mirrored in others and so on. And so you might think, well, you know, you might want your partner to show up with greater emotional sensitivity. Again, turn it around. Just turn them around. Turn these things around and see how you're showing up. And see if you can honestly answer that question and say, well, am I showing up with emotional integrity? I want them to notice what's going on with me. Am I noticing what's going on with me or with them, and so on and so forth? Just turn each accusation or each observation about your partner's behaviour that you do not like, flip it on its head and take a look at your own. And chances are you will find some mirroring going on. You might go, well, they're not showing up in their emotions. Are you? And so on and so forth. You know? Work on those areas with yourself, with great love. Work on building self-esteem if you need to. Open up to your partner with a bit of courage, a great deal of love. Do the difficult thing. Change your behaviour if you're in a loop, if you're stuck in a loop. Change your behaviour. Change it. Dare to change. If you've been very hard-headed and stubborn, soften. Just soften. And go up to them as a softer human. Be open and vulnerable and honest. And tell them what you need. Tell them how you are feeling. Do not expect them to know. Instantly, the fortress hopefully will dissolve as they meet you more than halfway, you know, by response. And then this fortress of negative emotions you've built around yourself as a sort of wall of indignant protection should hopefully crumble. And then you can really meet each other from a place of great honesty, great love, bit of courage. And you're going to build something together that's very, very beautiful. But it just requires that first step. It just requires that first step. So yeah, just my thoughts for today. So I hope that's been useful for somebody. I really do. And as I said, I'd recommend that book to just about anybody, because amazing. And I hope you have a lovely rest of the weekend. Take care. God bless.